Hello again. As you know, I am Eli, the computer guy. Today's class is Introduction to File Sharing. So this may seem like a very simple topic, and you may wonder why we have an entire class on just sharing files. Well, in the new world that we're in, sharing files is no longer the simple thing that it used to be. There are a lot of different ways to share files. There's a lot of different functionality in file sharing, and there's a lot of different products that you can use simply to allow multiple people to get to the same file or folder. This class is going to discuss all the different types and ways of sharing files so that you can decide either for yourself or for your client what way will serve you best. We're going to talk about web services for file sharing. We're going to talk about work groups, so where you actually have an internal LAN network. We're going to be talking about domains, but we're also going to talk about library systems where you can check in and check out certain files. We're going to talk about something called SMB, so you understand what that means. We're going to talk about synchronization. We're going to talk about real-time collaboration, and we're going to talk about how these things function in the real world. Some of these technologies sound really great until you're the poor bastard who actually has to use them. When it goes from the drawing board to the real world, like I say, some file sharing technologies look a whole lot better in theory than they do when you have some poor little secretary trying to figure out how to get to a file. So this class is Introduction to File Sharing, and we're going to go over all of these things so you really understand how file sharing works in the modern world. So the first thing that we need to talk about when we're talking about sharing files is something as basic as permissions. Permissions are the rights that people have for changing a file. Are they allowed to read the file? Are they allowed to write to the file? Or are they allowed to execute a file? Now, today we're going to talk about the three main permissions that every operating system basically share. And that's read, write, and execute. If you deal with a Microsoft server environment, as of 2008, I think they're up to like 15 different permissions. There's file, directory listing, and all kinds of stuff. Today, we are going to only talk about the three major permissions, read, write, and execute, because these are the permissions you will run into, again, whether you're using Windows, whether you're using Mac, whether you're using Linux or Unix, or whether you're using some kind of web service where you don't really even know what the operating system is. On top of the normal permissions of read, write, and execute, you then have something called ownership. So the owner of a file is usually the person who created the file, and they are the people that are allowed to change permissions on the file. So the owner of the file can say who can read it, who can write to it, and who can execute the file. So just keep that in mind. The owner of the file is the one that assigns permissions to the file or to the folder. So read is the first permission. R-E-A-D. Yeah, it's just the normal read. This is normally signified when you're looking at a permission. Like if you do a directory listing, it'll just say R. So read. Read means that you can read the file. So when you go to the file that's being shared, you can open it up, you can look at it, and that is it. So if it is a Word document and you open it up and you only have read permission, you can open it up, you can look at it. If you try to edit it and save it, you will not have permission to save it. You may be able to save it as a copy, you may be able to save it locally, but you will not be able to save it back to the original file. So that's important to remember. You then have write, W-R-I-T-E, again signified by a W. Write means that you can write to the file. So if you have both read and write permission, it means you can open the file up, you can edit it, and then you can save it back to the original source. Something that is very important to remember about these permissions is these permissions are all individual. You can have read permission without having write permission. But something takes a little bit to get through your head. You can have write permission without having read permission. This gets more into more complicated administration, so you probably will not see this very much, where somebody can write to a file, but they cannot read the file. Sometimes if you have certain types of scripts or people are supposed to like submit reports, so you want them to basically have to have a Dropbox where they could save to a folder, so they could write to a folder their report, but you don't want them to read it, or you don't want them to edit it, or you don't want them to read any other files within the folder. You could give the person write permission. So all these permissions are individual. You can give somebody read permission without write permission. You can even give somebody write permission without read permission. So all they can do is they can write to that file. Again, you don't see that very often, but it's good to remember that it's there. You can do that. And then you have execute. Execute, which is signified by an X. So execute means that if the file is a script, like a .php script or a Java script or an ASP script or something like that, that this gives you permission to actually execute that script. So if you don't have permission to execute the script, this script will not work. It will not run. This permission becomes much more important when you get into things like web administration, where you have a website, so you want certain people to be able to execute scripts and other people to not execute scripts. This doesn't come around very often with simple file sharing, because files are files. They're not executables. So, but you should just keep this in mind. So when you look at a directory listing, what you will normally see is RWX. If you look at a directory listing and it says RWX by the file, it means you have read, write, and execute permission. If you see RW nothing, that means you have read, write permission. If you see blank W nothing, it means you have write permission. If you see R blank blank, then it means you only have read permission. So these are the basic permissions that you're going to run across no matter what operating system you use. Read, very simple, you can read the file. Write means you can write to the file. You can edit the file. Execute means if it's a script, you can run that script. Again, in simple file sharing, you're not going to run into the execute problem very often because you don't have anything to execute. Write, once you start programming things like scripts or you get into more complicated web administration, this can be very useful because again, you can have them be able to write to a file but not read the file. So if you just want them to submit data, this can be very useful to have them have write permission without the read permission. And read. So and then if you're looking at it, it's RWX. It's always in this order for permissions. So you'll see RW blank means read write. Blank W blank means write, R blank blank means just read. And then finally, as I said in the beginning, the person who is allowed to give permissions to a file or folder is the owner of the folder. Normally the owner of the folder is whoever created the folder, but also in most operating systems you can transfer ownership to another person or to another user account, I should say. So just remember that the owner of the file or folder is the one that can create these permissions, and you can transfer that ownership to another person. So that's permissions for you. So now, before we get into the overall technologies where you decide how you're going to share files, we need to go over some of the philosophies or the underlying thoughts about how you share files. So the first way that you can share a file is using something called SMB. SMB. This means Server Message Block. SMB is used when you are sharing files on a local network. So this is the file sharing that you are probably most familiar with. This is where somebody has a Windows XP computer, they share a file or folder, and then you access that file or folder from another computer on the network. So you're able to open up the document, you're able to whatever permissions you have, you're able to do that to the document. SMB has a couple of benefits, but a couple of not so good things. When you open up a file using SMB, so it's on the local network, you just go to the shared folder and you open up that shared file. When you do that, that file locks. So you are the only person that is able to edit the file. if you have the right permission, we're going to assume with all these that you have the right permission to not make this confusing. So you have the ability to read and write to the file. So when you open up the file, you are opening up the original file. Nobody else can get into the original file. And if you make any changes, all of those changes are automatically saved when you hit the save button to that original file. So it's all about the original file. If another person tries to come in and open up that file while you're working on it, they will be told they can open up a read-only version. So they will have the ability to read the document, but they will not be able to save changes back to that document. This is very useful, SMB, on local networks. This does not work very well over the internet. The speed is just not good enough. And the problem is, though, with SMB, is if a second person does open up and edit the file, they're editing to a new file. They're editing to a copy of. So if you want to merge the two documents, so you open the original and you're editing it. Your partner opens up a read-only version of the original and they edit it. You actually have to go back and manually combine those two files because they are working with a copy. That's the problem with SMB. If you're the only one that's working on the file, or if only one person works on the file at a time, SMB is very good because, again, you open up the original file and you are editing the original file. If you have multiple people trying to edit the file, it's just, yeah, it's no good. The next way to share files is by doing something called synchronization, or sync. What happens with synchronization is you go to the original file or folder. And this can be used on the internet or the local network. Sync works everywhere. You go to the original file. You actually, when you start editing the original file, you actually create a copy of it yourself. It automatically creates a copy of that file. When you get done changing that file, it will ask you if you want to save the changes back to the original or not. So we'll say the last time this file was modified, the original file was modified is here. This is your file. This is when it was modified. Do you want to synchronize your changes back? So it creates a copy. In the first, it creates a copy automatically. But then at the end, if you want to synchronize the changes back, it then automatically merges your copy with the original file. This can be very useful because you can use this for files that are up on the internet, so you can actually download the file. It's easier to work on. You don't have to worry about your network connection dropping. One of the problems that you can have, this again goes to if multiple people are accessing and editing the same file, is you create a copy of the original. Then somebody else creates a copy of the original. So the original is here. Nobody's changing the original yet. But you two are still, you're working on copies. You're making your changes, they're making their changes. Well, then they may go back and synchronize, and so the original file is now synchronized with them. Well, you go back and you made all of these changes, but the changes aren't done real time, so you don't know that the other person did changes. So if you go back to synchronize, you may overwrite what the other person did. This is the problem with synchronization software. Depending on what synchronization software you use, they do have tools to try to prevent this type of thing, but this is the main issue with synchronization software. I like using synchronization software for my personal documents if only like one person is using the documents or two people are using the documents, because you can synchronize your files and folders to multiple different computers. And if you're the only one ever editing them, then you don't have to worry about this whole synchronization conflict issue. So that's with synchronization. It's good because you can use it over the internet and such, but if you have multiple people using the same document, you may end up overwriting each other. And knowing most users, they probably won't even notice. The next way you can share files or folders is something called library software, generically. This software is a lot like synchronization and started getting used a lot in the multimedia world. So when people are creating large websites, you have multiple people editing those websites. So some people edit the pictures, some people edit the infrastructure of the website, some people edit the video, etc. But you need to keep those files in one single location, so that if you go to preview the website, that you can actually see it. Because if everybody saved all these pictures and videos on their own desktop computers, all the material would be there, but it would be very difficult to turn that into a single website. What this library software allows you to do is you have one server, it basically has this library software on it, and people can check in and check out documents, videos, or whatever file that they're going to edit. So they go to the server, they find the document that they want, and it'll create a copy onto their computer. But what will happen is a little check mark will get pegged in the server, and it will say that this document has been checked out. And so the only way somebody else can start editing that document is if you check it back in. So basically, library software allows you to check in and check out documents, videos, files, whatever, from this main server. So everything stays on the server, all the copies are there and everything, but nobody else can edit that file until you've checked it back in. Again, this library software is not used a lot in most businesses. This is mainly used in the multimedia arena, when people are creating magazines, websites, etc. Those are the people that use this a lot. The final type of file sharing technology is something called real-time collaboration. So it's real-time collaboration. This is what I was kind of talking about before. It sounds like an amazingly wonderful idea that sucks. It's good on the drawing board. It's beautiful on the drawing board. Basically, what real-time collaboration software allows is multiple people can open up the exact same document at the exact same time, and they can all edit it at the exact same time. So if somebody starts typing a new sentence, that sentence, every time they hit another letter, will get added, and everybody will see it in real-time collaboration. Most of the time for real-time collaboration, both the file server, or wherever the document is stored, and the software that the people are using to edit the document have some type of communication technology. So you can't just use Word and a file server and do this. You have to have multiple bits of technology working together. But if you do have those bits of technology, like I say, everybody can open up the exact same document, and everybody is actually editing it at the same time, and everybody sees the edits at the same time. So it's not like SMB or Sync or any of this where the edits can get lost or you can write over somebody. Everybody sees what everybody else is doing. Again, this seems like a good idea. It seems like this is what you want. I think it's just horrible. It's just a pain in the butt. Because you have multiple people all editing the document at the exact same time. I mean, you've been in conferences and meetings, and you've seen, your work buddies try to work together. I mean, imagine them all like writing the document at the same time. I mean, it's hard enough getting people to write different parts of the document at the same time, much less the document itself. But that's what real-time collaboration is. So SMB is server message block. This is what you are most likely used to. Again, this is just a normal file sharing. Somebody shares a folder on Windows XP and you access it. You actually edit the original file when you open it up, and nobody else can edit the original file while you're editing it. So if they try to open the file, they will get a read-only version. You have synchronization. What this means is the original stays wherever it's at. You open up a copy of the original, then when you are done editing it, that copy is merged back to the original. This is really, really great if you only have one person working on the document, or if you have a good regime for how people open documents. But remember, if you have two people open the document at the same time, one person may sync their changes back, the other person will then overwrite what they did. That can be a real problem. You have the library software, again, not used a lot in the normal world, definitely used by artists. This is where you have one file server. You're able to check in and check out the files. So the original does stay on the server. It's like synchronization, But unlike synchronization, nobody else can open up that file until you're done with it. And of course, you have real-time collaboration. This is where everybody can open up the document at the exact same time, and they can literally edit the document real time, and everybody sees their changes real time. And again, sounds great on the drawing board. I would never want to use it. so that's the basic technology. Now let's get into how to actually share some files. So the first way you can share files with other people in your company, your organization, is through web services. So just web. This is probably about the easiest way that you can share files and folders to people that you need to share the files and folders to. This is where normally you go to Google, or you go to a company called Dropbox, or you get an online file or folder. And your files and folders are stored online. So you buy the service from GoDaddy or One-in-One or Dropbox. All of your files are stored online. They have a way for you to be able to give permissions and access to those files and folders to other people. So people may need to download special software, or they may just have to go to a website and put in a username and password. But all the permissions and all of that is done through the web services. This is a very simple way to share files and folders. Issues that you run into is if you do decide to start using web services, many of the web services use something called FTP. It's File Transfer Protocol, which makes it difficult, or I guess cumbersome, to edit and then save the files back up to their website. So a lot of times you can download the file very easily or view the file very easily, but in order to synchronize the changes back up onto the file server, you may have to go through a lot of just Megillah. That's a pain in the butt. You also have synchronization with web services normally, and again, like we talked about the synchronization before, if the web services that you are using use synchronization, this can be very useful, again, because you open up a copy of the original on your computer, you can edit it and then synchronize it back up. But again, if you have multiple people working on the same file, you may get some weird things with that synchronization. Generally, these web services are pretty inexpensive nowadays, but if you decide to use this for your organization, make sure you really understand the size limits of whatever product you buy. Many of the products nowadays give you 2 gigabytes or bits or 5 gigs or maybe 10 gigs of space. Depending on the size of your company, you may need 100 or 500 gigs. So before you decide to forego your own server or storing any of the data on any of the computers locally in your office, make sure that the web service that you're going with has enough storage, and it's also not ludicrously expensive. Sometimes, if you need 100 gigs of storage up on a web service, that might cost you $100 or $200 a month. That's pretty expensive. So web services, I'm sure at this point you've seen these. Basically, again, companies like Dropbox, Google Docs, that kind of thing. You just get a username and password. You're able to create a folder up on the internet. You can access that folder, again, either using a web browser or some type of software that's installed onto your computer. Make sure, though, you understand how you upload and download the files, because if it uses FTP, again, that can be a pain in the butt. What FTP means is you can open up, so you create a copy of the file locally, you open it up, you edit it, you actually have to save it locally and then re-upload it to the FTP server. Again, it's not horrible, but it's just a few extra steps that people may not want to take. And again, when you're dealing with employees, a few extra steps that people don't want to take means a few extra steps that are not going to be taken. So be careful with that. Synchronization, all this process will be done automatically for you. But that's web services. The next way to share files is on a work group. So Basically, all a work group is a bunch of computers connected on a local area network. So imagine you have a switch. So a switch is, what sends the network signal out to all the other computers. And you have one computer here, 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 and let's say one computer here. So you have 5 computers in this work group. Most operating systems work in a work group environment. We are going to go into in a few seconds domains where Microsoft works in. But most, Windows allows you to do work groups, Mac allows you to do work groups, Unix uses work groups, Linux uses work groups. Many times you're allowed to name the work group, so you will see like MS Home if you're using Microsoft Windows and you create a work group. Within the Windows software, you actually create a work group and then add yourself to it. We will have a class on that. It's pretty simple to do. But the main thing to remember with work groups is basically all it is local computers on the network that can talk to each other. The main thing with this is that every single computer on the network has its own security rules. So this computer has its own security rules, 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 and this computer has its own security rules. So if you have a folder here on this computer will have access rules on how you're able to get to that folder. So if you say Billy, let's say we'll put Billy down here, on computer 1 can read and write, so RW, but not execute. So all of this would be written onto this computer's access log. So if Billy tries to get on from computer 1, it goes up here, he puts in his username and password. If it's correct, he's able to access this file. Now, if the computer up here also wants Billy at computer 1 to be able to access a folder, it also has to create its own access rule. So it'll say Billy, computer 1, read, write. So every single computer in the work group has its own access rules. This is important, and if you get into a complicated network, this can cause real problems. If you're only dealing with 3 or 4 computers on a network, it's no big deal, but if you start dealing with 10, 20, 100 computers, everybody's trying to share information. This can be a real hassle because every single computer on the network has its own security rules, and you actually have to edit those security rules. So if you have, I don't know, Sue over here on computer 2, and you want her to be able to get to this folder, and this folder, this means each computer will have to have an access rule for Sue at computer 2 to be able to get to those folders. Again, this can be an administrative nightmare once you start getting to larger networks. Microsoft recommends, when you do their MCSE program or whatever, that work groups should only be up to 10 computers. They recommend that you maximize at 10 computers. It's kind of up to you, but if you're doing a lot of file sharing, that's not a bad place to stop. If you're dealing with the Microsoft world and most of the other computer worlds, a work group is going to be using that SMB protocol, that server message block. So when you actually open the file, so if Billy opens this file, he's actually opening the original file. And if Sue tries to go to it, she will get a read-only version of the file. So work groups use SMB, and every single computer on the network has its own access rules. So now that we've talked about work groups, let's talk about domains. Domains or domain controllers can make your life a whole bunch easier and just makes life a lot easier. So before, when we were talking about the work group, every single computer on the network, you had to edit and create its own security rules for how people or who could get into certain files and folders and do what to them. Basically, what happens with a domain controller is you have your normal switch and you have your computers just like before. So I'll just do 4. Now over here, you have the domain controller. So the domain controller is responsible for giving people access to resources on the network. This includes not just files, but folders, computers, printers, etc., etc. Anything that can be shared on the network, the security for it is controlled by this. It's called a domain controller. So what happens is when Billy on this computer logs in, so if you have a normal workgroup computer, you may have to log in or you may not. It's whatever the permission is on that particular computer. If you have a domain, you have to log in, because what happens is Billy logs in, his login credentials go to this domain controller. This domain controller looks through its security database and finds out what permissions Billy has on the network. Once it's figured out what permissions Billy has, it then creates something called an access key and sends it back to Billy. Now that Billy has that key, he can go to whatever resources he wants to on the network and simply be able to access them. So, for all the different files and folders that are shared on these computers, instead of having to create individual security databases on each individual computer, they all simply share whatever is on the domain controller. What makes the domain controller make your life even easier is that beyond simply giving you the access key, so you don't have to create so many security databases, you can also put people into groups. So let's put Billy, Sue, and George into one group. And they're just going to be called Group 1, right? Well, before, when we had that work group, if we wanted to give Billy and Sue and George permissions to a resource on a computer, you would actually have to create permissions for Billy and for Sue and for George. And if you wanted to do that on 2 computers, that means you'd have to do Billy, Sue, and George on one, Billy, Sue, and George on the other. If you wanted to do it on 5 computers, that means you would actually have to sit down and write out these access rules 15 times. Well, when you have a domain controller, since this domain controller deals with security for everything, you can put people into groups. So Group 1. So if this computer up here wants to share a file or folder to Billy, Sue, and George, they can just share that file to Group 1. And that's all they do. Instead of assigning permissions to everybody, they just say to Group 1. If Sue comes down here, she logs into this computer, she will get an access key from the domain controller, and then she can go up to this computer. Since she's part of Group 1, she can simply do whatever her permissions are on that file or folder. If George logs in here, he can also get to the file or folder on Group 1. So the domain controller, what happens and why you like domain controllers and they make your life easier, is it gives you one central place to administer file permissions, and as we'll go into in other classes, is things like security policies. So if you have a work group, every single computer on that network is responsible for its own security, which doesn't seem like a bad thing, again, until you're getting to 10 or 20 computers. I mean, if you have to make a major change, that means you have to sit down at every single computer and make that change, which really does, physically, takes a lot of time to do. If you have a domain controller on the network and you want to change security policies, or if you want to change permissions, you just go to this one domain controller and change the policies or permissions there. So imagine before, so we have Group 1, Billy, Sue, and George. If this was a work group, let's say Billy, Sue, and George were given permissions to 3 different computers. Now imagine that George was demoted. He wasn't fired. Let's just say he got drunk and he swatted somebody's butt and wasn't supposed to. So he got demoted, he got smacked. So he's now no longer allowed to see the same files and folders that Billy and Sue are. He's getting his hand smacked. He's not making as much money anymore. If this was a work group and you had 3 different computers with the permissions for George on them, you would have to change the permission at this computer and this computer, and this computer. So you would physically have to sit down and change the file permissions at each of these computers. Where, if you just have group 1, and that is on the domain controller, all you have to do is sit down at the domain controller, remove George's name from this group, and now he no longer has permission to get to the files and folders. So this is why the administration really matters. If you have a work group, you have to sit down at each individual computer and do the editing. If you have a domain controller, you simply sit down at the domain controller, you remove one name from a group, and that's it. You're done. So again, we are going to go over much more of domain controllers and work groups. I just want to give you an idea of kind of how they work. So this class hopefully gave you an overview, an idea of the different ways that files and folders can be shared. Nowadays, like I say, there are multiple ways to share files and folders, and so I don't want you thinking that, again, that you have to have a domain controller if you want to share files and folders to other people in your organization. Using web services might be fine for you. You know, maybe a work group is okay. Maybe you do need a domain controller, but these are all the different ways that you can share files and folders so people can get access to them. We talked about the permissions today. Remember, Windows, if you get into Windows Server Administration, I think they have like 15 different permissions now, but the standard, the stock standard permissions that everybody uses is read, write, and execute. You know, read is read, write is write, execute basically means you can execute a script. So at this point, you're probably not going to have to worry about execute. Remember, these are all separate permissions. You can give somebody permissions to write to a file without being able to read to it. It sounds a little weird to you now, but like I said, when you get into more advanced administration, this may actually be useful for you. We've talked about different ways that data is shared. We talked about SMB, Server Message Block. This is, again, somebody goes to the shared file, opens up the original file, and that file is now locked to everybody else. People can go to it, but they will only be allowed to open a read-only version. So the person opens the file originally, they're working on the original file. If they hit save, everything gets saved back to that original file. We talked about synchronization. Sync means you create a copy of the original, and then when you are done and you like what you've done, you then merge your copy to the original. So when you're actually doing this, when you're editing, there's two different documents that are open. If you have multiple people all trying to edit the document at the same time, this can be bad because people don't know what everybody else is doing. So when they all go back to synchronize, this person will synchronize first, then this person will synchronize, and this person will synchronize, and this person will synchronize. You may end up with a colossal mess, so be very, very careful with synchronization. We talked about the library software. Again, this is not used for the most part in most companies, but if you're dealing with like the multimedia professionals, they use this kind of software. So again, they create a copy of the document, but they actually check it out of the server. Nobody else can mess with that document until they check it back in. Once it gets checked back in, somebody else can check it out. They check it back in, somebody else can check it out. And then we talked about real-time collaboration. Again, I think this sounds great on the drawing board. In the real world, it would be brutal. You'd have to be working with much better people than I have ever worked with for real-time to work well, I think. But basically, what real-time is, everybody opens up the same document at the same time. When one person makes a change, everybody sees that change. So people are literally working on the original document at the exact same time. If it works for you, it works for you. I'm not going to sell it to any client. Then we talked, how are we actually then going to share these files? We talked about web services. This is very simple. Again, you go to GoDaddy.com and get an online file folder, or you go to a company called Dropbox, etc. Basically, your files and folders are stored online, and you use their system to create permissions and such to those files and folders. People are then either able to access the files or folders through a web browser, and they just log in and can connect to it, or through software that is installed on their computer. There's two, again, as I talked about, there's two different ways that this software, web services, usually works for sharing files. One is FTP, one is some type of synchronization program. If you're using FTP, remember, you open up the file, you save the file locally, and then you have to upload it back up to their system. This doesn't sound bad until you're dealing with people in the real world. Again, the more steps, the more manual steps you put into a process, the more likely it is that employees aren't going to do it. And frankly, if the employees don't do it, then why bother? The synchronization software essentially does a lot of what the FTP software does, but it does it all automatically. So it creates a copy locally. When you hit save locally, it then closes it and then re-uploads that data automatically and merges your changes to the original. Again, this is better because it does it automatically. And I swear to you, automatic is better. We talked about work groups. So work groups generally use SMB, that server message block, to share the files. So if I want to open up a file on another computer, I actually open up that original file, etc., as we talked about before. The main thing with work groups is every single computer on the network has its own security policies. So if you want to share a file with Billy and Sue and George on this computer, then you have to create a policy for Billy and Sue and George. If you want to share a different file to Billy and Sue and George over here, you have to create, again, security policy, Billy and Sue and George. Again, anybody you want to give permissions to a file, you have to go to each individual computer and make those changes. A small network where you don't do a lot of changes, this might be fine because, again, work groups are a whole lot less expensive than networks with domains on them. A server, a domain controller, is going to cost you a few $1,000s. So if you have a small network, you don't do very many changes, a work group might be the perfect fit for you. On the other hand, if you have a network that has 10 or more computers and a lot of things are going on, if you have that domain controller acts as the single place for all your security, your permissions, everything. So people log in. When they log in, their credentials are given to the server. The server gives them an access key, and then they can use that little access key to get to whatever files or folders or resources they need to on the network. So again, like I say, if George did something stupid, he got fired, etc., instead of going to each individual computer and having to remove his permissions to a file or folder, you just go to that one domain controller and erase him. So basically, you can either take 2 minutes and erase his name out of one record on the domain controller, or you can go to this desk and fix it, and this desk, and this desk, and this desk, and this desk. So I mean, think about it. Think about the time saving. This process here, if you have a domain controller, this process will take 2 minutes. If you have a work group and that person has very many permissions on very many computers, that might be a couple of hours because you've got to move the person. So if it's secretary or if an assistant's working at the computer, you have to ask them to move, then you have to log in as the administrator or whatever, then you have to remove the permission. That really can take a lot of time. So this is the introductory class on how you share files and folders. We have a lot more to go. Realize my MCSE for Windows 2000 way back when was 120 hours. So this is a first step. We have many more steps to go. So if you don't feel like you've learned enough about sharing files right now, it's probably because you haven't. Again, we're still in the introduction phase of this whole track. As you know, I'm Eli, the computer guy. We're going to be digging more into this very shortly, so I hope to see you at another class.